A hush falls over the assembly. Not the enforced silence of a cathedral, but the living quiet of shared anticipation. We are in a Galilean synagogue, sometime in the early 1st century. The air is thick with the scent of sun-baked stone, olive oil lamps, and the dry, papery aroma of ancient scrolls. Light, the brilliant, unforgiving light of the Near East, cuts through a high window, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in its beam. It falls upon the faces of men and women, separated by a low partition, their expressions a mixture of devotion, intellectual curiosity, and communal familiarity. This is not just a house of worship. It is the town hall, the library, the courtroom, the very heart of their world. In the center of the room, on a raised platform known as the bima, stands the synagogue attendant. With a reverence born of centuries of tradition, he opens the wooden chest, the kabbadah, the holy ark, and carefully lifts out a heavy scroll. It is the book of the prophet Isaiah. The scroll is unrolled, its creamy parchment crackling softly in the stillness. The dense black Hebrew characters, each one a vessel of divine speech, march in disciplined columns across the page. A man from the congregation is called forward. He might be a local artisan, a fisherman, a teacher. He approaches the chazak, touches the parchment with the corner of his prayer shawl, and then kisses the shawl, a gesture of profound love and respect for the words he is about to proclaim. He begins to read, his voice a resonant chant that is echoed in this land for generations. The passage speaks of hope, of justice, of a coming redemption. When he finishes, he does not simply sit down. He turns to the assembly, and the reading transforms into a discourse. He begins to interpret the text, to connect it to their daily lives, their fears, their aspirations. This is the Hazarah, the homily, a practice of wrestling with Scripture to uncover its contemporary meaning. This scene, vibrant with tradition and scholarly debate, was the indispensable rhythm of Jewish life for centuries before the birth of Christianity. It was the school where the people learned their story, the forum where they debated their obligations to God and to each other. Now let us allow the scene to dissolve and reform. Fast forward a few decades. The location shifts to a bustling multicultural metropolis, Antioch, a key hub in the Roman Empire. The setting is not a dedicated public building, but a private home, the courtyard of a wealthy patron. The air smells not of ancient parchment, but of baking bread and cheap wine. The faces are different too. There are Jews, yes, but also Greeks, Syrians, Romans, men and women, slave and free, who have embraced a radical new message about a resurrected Messiah. They gather not on the Sabbath, the 7th day, but on the 1st day of the week, the Lord's Day. And what do? Someone stands and reads from the Scriptures, perhaps from that same scroll of Isaiah, but also from a letter recently received from an apostle named Paul. Afterwards, another person, a leader in the community, stands to offer an exposition, an exhortation, urging them to live according to the words they have just heard. They share communal prayers, and then they break bread and share a cup of wine in a ritual meal that commemorates their Lord's final Passover. The parallels are not just striking, they are overwhelming. The sequence is unmistakable: scripture reading, followed by a sermon or homily, followed by communal prayers, and concluding with a ritual act of fellowship. Is this mere coincidence? Is it possible that two distinct religious movements, born in the same cradle of the world, independently developed such a remarkably similar architecture for their most sacred gatherings? Or is something far more profound at play? Could it be that the very structure of the synagogue, that ancient and venerable institution, secretly provided the foundational blueprint for the Christian Sunday service? This question is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. It probes the very nature of religious origins, forcing us to confront a tension that lies at the heart of faith itself: the dynamic interplay between divine innovation and deep, inescapable cultural continuity. It challenges the common narrative of a faith born fully formed from a singular revelation, suggesting instead a story of inheritance, adaptation, and transformation. To understand the Christian Church, it seems we must first step back through its doors, enter the synagogue. What exactly was in that original blueprint, and how did it come to be the cornerstone of a new spiritual edifice?
Building on that striking structural similarity, we must now move from a wide architectural view
to a detailed examination of the liturgical components themselves. To truly grasp the depth of the inheritance, we have to immerse ourselves in the spiritual rhythm of that first-century synagogue service. Imagine yourself there. The service begins not with a reading, but with a profound declaration of faith. The congregation rises and recites the "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This is more than a creed. It is the central pillar of Jewish identity, a daily commitment to monotheism and covenant. Following this powerful communal affirmation, a different kind of prayer ensues, the Amidah, or the standing prayer. The congregation stands, facing Jerusalem, and prays a series of benedictions in silence. It is a moment of deep personal communion with the divine, a structured yet intimate conversation covering praise, petition, and thanksgiving. Only after these foundational acts of creed and prayer does the service move to its instructional core. This venerable order of worship, declaration, personal prayer, and then scriptural instruction, formed the spiritual backbone of Jewish communities across the Roman world. The centerpiece, as we saw, was the reading from the scrolls. A portion from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was read, followed by a corresponding selection from the prophets, the Tanakh. This pairing was deliberate, creating a dialogue between law and prophecy, history and hope. Because many in the congregation spoke Aramaic rather than Hebrew, a translator, or gaga, would often provide a running paraphrase, ensuring the text was accessible. And then came the Dvar Torah, the word of Torah, a sermon that unpacked the readings, applying their ancient wisdom to the present moment. Now, hold that intricate structure in your mind, and let us turn to the earliest Christian sources. The book of Acts, our first history of the church, gives us a tantalizing summary of the Jerusalem community. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Scholars see in this a clear echo of the synagogue's form. Apostles' teaching corresponds to the readings and sermon, prayer to the communal prayers like the Amidah, and fellowship and breaking of bread point to the communal meal that would become the Eucharist. The evidence becomes even more explicit as we move outside the New Testament. The Didache, a late 1st or early 2nd century church manual, provides instructions for worship, including prayers and a detailed outline for the Eucharist. But our most valuable eyewitness account comes from around the year 155 CE. A Christian philosopher named Justin Martyr wrote his Apology to the Roman Emperor, defending Christians against false accusations. In doing so, he provided a priceless, detailed description of their Sunday service. He writes, "On the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray. The sequence is identical: readings from Scripture, a homily from the leader, and communal prayers. The liturgy of the word, readings, sermon, prayers, is nearly identical to the synagogue structure. As the renowned historian of early Christianity, Everett Ferguson, states unequivocally, the synagogue provided the basic structure for the Christian service, especially the service of the word. This was not plagiarism, it was a natural continuation. The first Christians were Jews. For them, the synagogue service was not a foreign model to be copied, but the only way they knew how to worship God as a community. They took the vessel of worship they had always known and filled it with a new wine, the message of Jesus Christ. The Eucharist, while uniquely Christian in its theological focus on the body and blood of Christ, itself grew out of the soil of Jewish table fellowship, the Josana meals and the Passover Seder, with its blessings over bread and wine. It was a profound act of reinterpretation, taking a familiar ritual and imbuing it with a radical new meaning. The blueprint was not just copied, it was inhabited, renovated, and expanded upon. But as with any renovation, there comes a point where the new structure begins to look so different from the old that it can no longer be seen as the same house. What happened when this process of adaptation began to accelerate, leading not just to divergence, but to a painful, historic separation? From that deep liturgical inheritance, we trace the complex and often tragic process of divergence. The shared blueprint, once a symbol of common origins, became a contested ground upon which a new, distinct Christian identity was forged. Imagine a tense conversation in a dusty Ephesian courtyard around the turn of the 2nd century. A Jewish follower of Jesus, who still feels the sacred rhythm of the Sabbath in his bones, is debating with a Gentile convert, a former pagan for whom Saturday holds no special significance. For the Jewish Christian, abandoning the Sabbath feels like a betrayal of God's eternal covenant. For the Gentile, clinging to it feels like an unnecessary barrier to the universal message of Christ. This small, intimate argument reflects a tectonic shift occurring across the burgeoning Christian movement. The deliberate move of the main communal worship from the Jewish Sabbath, the 7th day, to the first day of the week was arguably the most significant practical and theological departure. It was a weekly declaration of independence. This transition symbolized a new covenant, grounding Christian life not in the memory of the first creation, but in the reality of the new creation, inaugurated by Christ's resurrection on what they began to call the Lord's Day. While the fundamental structure of the liturgy of the Word was preserved, its content and emphasis began to shift. The memoirs of the apostles, what would become the Gospels, and the letters of Paul were increasingly read alongside, and sometimes with more prominence than, the Hebrew prophets. The sermon, while still an exposition of Scripture, now focused almost exclusively on interpreting the entire Hebrew Bible as a prophecy, fulfilled in Jesus. The most profound divergence, however, occurred in the second half of the service. The Eucharist, the breaking of bread and wine, evolved from a fellowship meal into the central, defining sacrament of Christian worship. It became the mystery, the sacred drama at the heart of the faith, the moment where believers felt they were in the most direct communion with their risen Lord. This elevation of the Eucharist created a liturgical focal point that was entirely distinct from the synagogue, where the central sacred object and event remained the Torah scroll and its public reading. This growing liturgical distinctiveness was both a cause and a consequence of a wider social and theological separation. Early Christian leaders, known as the Church Fathers, began to articulate a theology of distinction, often in stark, polemical terms. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 CE, urged Christians to live in accordance with Christianity and to no longer observe the Sabbath, framing the two as mutually exclusive. This process of boundary drawing was fueled by historical pressures. The Roman destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, which radically reshaped both Judaism and Christianity, the competition for converts in the Greco-Roman world, and the need for the nascent Christian community to define itself to Roman authorities as a religion distinct from Judaism. This theological separation, over the course of 2 centuries, hardened into a parting of the ways. The shared blueprint was obscured, plastered over with layers of new doctrine, distinct rituals, and, tragically, mutual suspicion and hostility. The memory of the synagogue as the mother of the church was not just lost. In many quarters, it was actively suppressed in favor of a supersessionist narrative, the idea that the church had simply replaced Israel. So what does it mean for us today to excavate this forgotten blueprint? It is far more than an academic exercise in liturgical history. To acknowledge this profound debt is to fundamentally reframe the relationship between two of the world's great faiths. For Christians, it is an invitation to humility and gratitude, a chance to understand their own worship not as a de novo creation, but as a branch growing from an ancient and life-giving trunk. It challenges the very roots of supersessionism and the anti-Judaism that has stained Christian history. For Jews and Christians engaged in interfaith dialogue, this shared heritage provides a powerful, tangible common ground, a shared language of prayer, scripture, and community that predates their centuries of painful division. Uncovering this foundational connection reveals that the walls built between the church and the synagogue were not part of the original design. The blueprint tells a story of a shared beginning, a common spiritual grammar. It is a testament to a time when the lines were not yet drawn, a powerful reminder that the deepest roots of faith are often intertwined in ways we are only now beginning to rediscover.